Imagine standing in the Hall of Mirrors at the Royal Alcazar of Madrid in the autumn of 1680. You are a Venetian diplomat, freshly arrived with letters of friendship from the Doge himself. The guards escort you through corridors draped in Flemish tapestries, past paintings of conquering Spanish kings astride magnificent stallions. You expect to meet Charles XII, sovereign of the Spanish Empire, ruler of territories spanning from Milan to Manila, from Brussels to Buenos Aires. The doors open. What shuffles toward you is something your mind struggles to categorize as human. The king's mouth hangs perpetually agape, unable to close even for a moment. Saliva pools at the corners and drips onto the ermine collar of his royal vestments. His jaw protrudes so grotesquely that you can see the full row of his lower teeth even from 15 paces away. When he attempts to greet you, the sounds that emerge are wet, garbled syllables that his translator must decipher. This is the most powerful monarch in Europe, and he looks like God's cruelest experiment. Before we descend into this dynasty's darkest chapter, if you're fascinated by history's most haunting truths, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me which corner of the world you're tuning in from. It absolutely astounds me that we're all here, scattered across continents and time zones, united by our shared hunger to understand the twisted paths of human history. Charles X wasn't born this way by accident. He wasn't struck by disease or cursed by witchcraft, despite what his own court would later claim. He was engineered, designed across 11 generations of deliberate, systematic genetic catastrophe. The Spanish Habsburgs had spent 2 centuries building the greatest empire since Rome, and in the process, they destroyed the one thing no empire can survive without a viable heir. This is the story of how absolute power produced absolute genetic collapse, and how one man's broken body became the tombstone of an entire dynasty. The House of Habsburg didn't stumble into genetic disaster. They walked into it with eyes wide open, generation after generation, choosing power over biology. To understand Charles II's condition, we must first understand the calculated madness that created him. The dynasty that would eventually produce Charles began its Spanish reign in 1516, when Charles V inherited a patchwork of territories that would become history's first global empire. Spanish conquistadors were claiming entire continents. Silver flowed from the mines of Potosi. The Spanish Armada ruled the seas. But the Habsburgs faced a persistent problem: how to keep all this wealth and territory within the family bloodline. Their solution was elegant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its execution. They would marry exclusively within their own dynasty, uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin. When those options ran thin, they arranged marriages between individuals already related through multiple family connections. The Habsburg family tree stopped being a tree and became something more resembling a tangled vine, looping back on itself in ways that defied both nature and common sense. Court genealogists in the 17th century created massive wall charts attempting to track the family connections. These documents, preserved in the Archive of the Indies in Seville, reveal a pattern so systematic it appears almost ritualistic. Philip X, who ruled Spain at the height of its power, married 4 times. 3 of his wives were close relatives. His 4th wife, Anna of Austria, was simultaneously his niece, his first cousin once removed, and through earlier marriages, effectively his second cousin as well. Their son, Philip III, continued the tradition by marrying Margaret of Austria, his first cousin. Philip III and Margaret's son, Philip IV, married Mariana of Austria, who was both his niece and his first cousin. Philip IV and Mariana's son was Charles II. Modern geneticists who have studied the Habsburg pedigree calculate that Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. To contextualize this number, offspring of full siblings typically measure around 0.25. But unlike a single generation of sibling incest, Charles's coefficient was the result of accumulated genetic damage across 2 centuries. Where a normal person has 32 great-great-great-grandparents, Charles had only 10 unique individuals occupying those 32 positions. The same names appeared over and over in his family tree, twisted into impossible configurations. Philip III was simultaneously Charles's grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather through different branches of the family. The archives reveal that Habsburg advisors understood the danger. Physicians attached to the Spanish court documented increasing rates of infant mortality, stillbirths, and physical deformities among royal children throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. A medical treatise from 1632, housed in the Biblioteca Nacional de España, explicitly warns that marriages of blood too close produce children of diminished capacity and monstrous form. The warning went unheeded. The Habsburgs possessed a theological justification for their practice. They believed their bloodline carried divine right, that God himself had selected their family to rule. To dilute this sacred blood with commoners, even noble commoners, would be to reject God's plan. Better a deformed heir than an impure one. Better a sick dynasty than a contaminated one. This wasn't ignorance. This was ideology elevated above biology, faith placed above evidence, dynasty above survival. By the time Charles II's mother, Mariana of Austria, went into labor on November 6, 1661, the Spanish court had already buried 3 previous heirs who hadn't survived infancy. The pressure for a living male heir was suffocating. When the midwives finally pulled the child from the birth canal, the celebration that should have thundered through Madrid never came. Instead, a horrified silence spread through the birthing chamber like ice forming on a pond. The infant's head was grotesquely oversized, wobbling on a neck that seemed too thin to support it. His eyes sat too far apart, giving his face an amphibian quality. But most disturbing was his mouth, frozen open in a permanent gape, the lower jaw jutting forward in a way that made the child's face look more like a caricature than a human infant. Palace records from the first years of Charles' life, preserved in the Archivo General de Simancas, paint a portrait of developmental catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. At 6 months, Charles could not hold up his own head. At 1 year, he could not sit upright without support. At 2 years, he had not begun teething. The royal physicians, bound by oaths of secrecy, documented his condition in coded language, referring to delicate health and slow ripening. But their private correspondence, discovered centuries later, revealed their true horror. Dr. Geronimo de Gatelu wrote to a colleague that the prince suffers from afflictions that suggest the bloodline has turned upon itself. Charles did not speak his first word until age 4, and that word, according to court diaries, was nearly unintelligible. His tongue, swollen and seemingly too large for his mouth, transformed every syllable into a slurred approximation. Walking came even later. The prince remained essentially immobile until his 8th year, carried from room to room by servants who whispered prayers of protection under their breath. When Charles finally took his first unassisted steps at age 8, the event was commemorated with a private mass of thanksgiving. But those who witnessed the moment described it less as walking and more as lurching, a desperate stumbling from one piece of furniture to the next, his twisted spine forcing him into a permanent hunch. The young prince's cognitive development matched his physical delays. At 10 years old, Charles was still learning the alphabet. His tutors reported that information seemed to slide through his mind like water through cupped hands. He could not retain lessons from one day to the next. Simple arithmetic remained forever beyond his grasp. Reading, when he finally achieved it, was a laborious process where he traced each letter with his finger, sounding out words like a much younger child. Yet, beneath this cognitive fog, something else flickered. Charles's eyes, multiple courtiers noted, held a terrible awareness. He understood, on some level, that he was different, that the servants crossed themselves when they approached him, that his mother wept when she looked at him, that his father, King Philip IV, spent less and less time in his presence as the years advanced, They could not look away, though many wished to. Charles was the heir to the Spanish throne, and every noble family in Europe watched his development with a mixture of fascination and dread. The Spanish Habsburgs had implemented elaborate rituals around their heirs, ceremonies designed to display royal vigor and divine blessing. These rituals now became exercises in collective delusion. When Charles turned 10, tradition required him to receive ambassadors in formal audience. The court spent weeks preparing. Special furniture was commissioned, designed to conceal Charles's hunched posture. His clothing was tailored to disguise his twisted frame. Servants rehearsed elaborate choreography that would minimize the time foreign dignitaries spent in direct conversation with the prince. The machinery of deception operated at industrial scale. Charles's food had to be prepared in ways that allowed him to eat without the humiliating spectacle of public drooling. Everything was mashed, pureed, or liquefied. Even then, meals were messy affairs. His jaw's misalignment meant that his teeth never came close to meeting. Chewing was impossible. The upper row of teeth sat completely behind the lower row, creating a grotesque underbite that left his mouth perpetually agape. Court kitchens developed increasingly elaborate preparations, trying to create dishes that looked normal but required no actual chewing. Roasted meats became meat paste. Fresh bread became bread soup. Vegetables were pulverized beyond recognition. Dining became theater. Servants stood at attention with silk napkins, constantly dabbing at the corners of the king's mouth where food and saliva inevitably leaked. Charles developed an acute self-consciousness about eating in public. Foreign ambassadors began to notice that official state dinners would include the king seated at the head of the table, but he would not eat. Dishes would be placed before him, then quietly removed, untouched. Only in the privacy of his chambers, with a single trusted servant, would Charles attempt to eat, and even then the process could take hours. His speech impediment created its own diplomatic nightmare. The king of the Spanish Empire could not communicate clearly in any language. When Charles attempted to speak, sounds emerged that even native Spanish speakers struggled to interpret. His tongue, enlarged and poorly controlled, transformed consonants into muddy approximations. His perpetually open jaw made forming words a visible struggle, jaw muscles working uselessly, tongue writhing to produce sounds his anatomy rendered impossible. The solution was as practical as it was humiliating. Charles's verbal decrees were immediately transcribed by court scribes who specialized in interpreting his garbled speech. These scribes, sworn to secrecy about the king's true condition, would listen to Charles's attempts at communication, then produce written versions that foreign ambassadors and Spanish officials could actually read. Important matters of state required written communication. Treaties were presented to Charles for his signature, not his verbal assent. Laws carried his written seal, but rarely his spoken word. The facade worked after a fashion, for those who observed Charles from a distance. But ambassadors who met him face to face carried away memories that haunted them for years. The French ambassador, the Marquis de Villars, wrote in his private correspondence that Charles has a body as weak as his mind. He has a ravenous stomach and he swallows all he eats whole, for his nether jaw stands so much out that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet. The Venetian ambassador was more blunt, describing Charles as short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before 35. These descriptions circulated in European capitals, transforming the Spanish king into an object of morbid curiosity and diplomatic calculation. If Charles could not produce an heir, what would happen to the Spanish Empire? They could not look away. The question of Spanish succession began to dominate European politics while Charles still lived, a grotesque countdown to the extinction of a dynasty that had once ruled half the known world. The marriage of Charles II became Europe's most urgent political project. He was 23 years old, perpetually ill, but alive, and the entire Spanish Empire's future depended on his ability to produce a legitimate heir. The Spanish court selected Marie-Louise d'Orléans, niece of Louis XIV of France, as Charles' first bride. She was 17, described by contemporaries as vivacious and intelligent, educated in the sophisticated French court. When she arrived in Spain in 1679, she expected to become a queen. What she became instead was a prisoner in a nightmare she could not escape. The wedding night was a disaster that palace servants whispered about for decades afterward. Charles, who had been sheltered and kept ignorant of physical intimacy, approached his marital duties with the confusion of a child. His reproductive organs, examined after his death, were found to be severely underdeveloped, described in the autopsy report as very small, like those of an infant. Conception was physiologically improbable, perhaps impossible. But admitting this would have triggered a constitutional crisis. Instead, the Spanish court manufactured an elaborate fiction. The problem must be with Marie Louise. The young queen was subjected to humiliations that would have broken stronger women. Court physicians performed invasive examinations, searching for some defect in her anatomy that could explain the lack of pregnancy. She was forced to drink revolting herbal concoctions, the recipes drawn from ancient medical texts and folk superstition. She underwent fertility rituals that mixed Catholic prayer with practices that bordered on paganism. Marie Louise's letters to her family in France, preserved in the Archives Nationales, document her psychological deterioration. She wrote of being married to a ghost, of spending her days in prayer, begging the Virgin Mary for release through either pregnancy or death. She described Charles not as a monster, but as pitiable beyond description, noting that he seemed as trapped as she was, aware of his inadequacies but helpless to change them. After 10 years of marriage, Marie Louise died suddenly in 1689 at age 27. The official cause was listed as acute abdominal pain, possibly appendicitis. But rumors of suicide spread through the court. Some whispered poison. Others suggested she had simply lost the will to live, her body surrendering to a despair that had consumed her mind years earlier. Charles remarried within months. The Spanish court could not afford to give up. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, arrived with fresh determination to produce an heir. She lasted longer than Marie Louise, but the result was the same. No pregnancies, no children, no hope. As the years passed and Charles's health continued to decline, the question of succession became Europe's central crisis. Charles had no siblings who survived infancy. His father's other children were all dead. The Spanish Habsburg line, once the most prolific dynasty in Europe, had been reduced to a single sickly man whose body was visibly failing. They could not look away. Foreign powers began positioning themselves for the coming war over Spanish territory, sharpening their diplomatic arguments and military preparations, while Charles still drew breath, treating his inevitable death as a political opportunity rather than a human tragedy. When medicine failed, the Spanish court turned to exorcism. Father Antonio Alvarez de Argüelles, appointed as Charles's personal confessor, concluded that the king's condition was not medical but demonic. This wasn't a fringe theory. This was official court doctrine, endorsed by the Spanish Inquisition itself. Between 1698 and 1700, Charles underwent repeated exorcism sessions conducted in the royal palace. These were not quiet, private affairs. They were elaborate ceremonies attended by nobles, clergy, and foreign observers who recorded the spectacle in horrified detail. Father Argüelles would begin each session by forcing Charles to consume holy water mixed with ground relics of saints. The king would immediately vomit, which the priest interpreted as demons resisting the holy substance. Charles would then be subjected to hours of prayer, sometimes violent physical manipulation as priests attempted to literally wrestle evil spirits from his body. Crucifixes were pressed against his skin until he screamed. Holy water was splashed in his face. Latin incantations thundered through the throne room while the King of Spain writhed and wept on the floor. The exorcist concluded that Charles had been cursed through witchcraft, that enemies of Spain had employed black magic to render him infertile and weak. This diagnosis led to witch hunts throughout the kingdom. Women were arrested, tortured, and executed on charges of bewitching the king. Charles himself, in his limited mental capacity, came to believe in the demonic explanation. He begged for more exorcisms whenever his physical pain intensified, convinced that spiritual cleansing was his only hope for relief. On November 1, 1700, Charles II died at 38, looking 70. His autopsy revealed the toll of 11 generations of inbreeding. A heart the size of a peppercorn, corroded lungs, putrid intestines, a head full of water, and not a single drop of blood. Modern medicine sees this as multiple organ failure, hormonal collapse, and genetic disorder. Charles had been dying his entire life. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, and Europe plunged into the 13-year War of Spanish Succession. The empire fractured. The dynasty's obsession with purity ended in extinction. In the Prado's portrait, his pale face and malformed jaw betray the truth. He was the product, not the cause, of his family's madness. The Habsburgs believed power could defy nature. Nature proved them wrong. Charles II's body became evolution's verdict proof that human will cannot outvote biology. His suffering exposed the cost of arrogance, that purity pursued too far becomes decay, that greatness hoarded becomes ruin. He died alone, the last of his line, his empire collapsing. Not a monster, but a man destroyed by his lineage, a tragic warning that some bloodlines, when too tightly guarded, simply end.